Oop. Autoplay. There we go. Well, it looks like I've stumped Renegade. Oop. So that's always pleased to. Part of these streams has become name this tune with Renegade. And I'm just getting myself in position on my chair, and I'm not going to move for the next 2 hours.
I can't hear you on Discord. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah. Why? I know why you can't hear me on Discord. Give me 1 sec. There you go. You should be able to hear me now.
Yep. Oh, good.
Cool.
So just for the record, Doctor has not signed off on this live stream.
Oh, no.
Going rogue.
Off the reservation.
I'm a little bit lightheaded, but the show must go on.
Are you
YouTube
actually?
is a rough business. Yeah. I think I've lost so much blood in the last 7 days that, or even prior to that, I was already losing blood prior to that. So,
really? That much blood?
Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah. It's weird because for the first month that I was having problems, I didn't really know that I was that ill. But I was slowly losing blood even then. And then when it finally got serious, and I don't know how much I lost in the surgery, so.
Shit, dude. I didn't realize it was that bad.
Yeah. Anyway, carry on. First slide.
I realized I might have just made a slightly amateur mistake. I'm looking for... I don't know. I'm missing a number cue card that I use. I don't think I ever even wrote it. I'm missing number 5. I just think I didn't even ever write number 5. Anyway, wow. Oh well, we're going live. So, has Renegade figured it out? Is Renegade ready for the answer? Yeah, not a lot to say. Jeff's been unwell, so we put it off. Just to say, the live stream that I did solo on Friday, my internet dropped, and I'll be picking that up where I left off this Friday. If you guys were watching it, and it's sort of functioning as the bonus features for Quigley. So stuff from the Evolution of Civilizations that was not relevant to this stuff, but I thought was interesting and worth covering. Today we're doing, that's my little joke there, Keck, Tragedy and Hope, episode 15, 1950 to 1957, Korea, Eisenhower, and Khrushchev, a Bucklander lecture series. And can you believe it, Jeff? I think there's only 2 more episodes after this. Should I not?
Is that including the recap?
No. That'll be 2 more episodes of chapters covered, I think.
Okay.
And then I think the last episode, the chapter 20, might be recap as well, because chapter 20 is Quigley trying to look into the future, and some things from what I remember, some things he doesn't really do very well with. Because the sort of system Kennedy tries to set up, right? So Quigley's writing in 66. He publishes the book in 66. Kennedy's dead in 63, and I think Quigley has some hope for some institutions acting in a positive way that Kennedy sort of gets rolling, like the Organization of American States. But after 66, Quigley then gets rather pessimistic, and the Organization of American States is not like a significant player, really, from what I can tell. Unless there's some, like, oh, actually, it's... You know, I'm ready for, like, someone to post in the chat, actually, it's super significant because XYZ esoteric reason. Anyway, last episode, which was 3 weeks ago now, I think, we looked at the book Quigley wrote that was never published, The Anglo-American Establishment, not published in his lifetime. I gave my sort of account of the intellectual lineage of that group, and this sort of combination of humanism and utilitarianism meeting a sort of nonconformist Christianity, and how that created this sort of Frankenstein's monster out of various parts that has gotten us to where we are today. How that attitude motivated particularly Lord Milner and Lionel Curtis and the establishment, and how they sort of used NGOs and newspapers. And towards the end, I said a little bit about how that exists now, and how those players, they're not, these connections are not really being made in the Oval Office, right? Where they're being made is in, drinks at the Kennedy Center, at intermission, funding of this or that, social events, which is how Epstein operated. And Epstein funded these charities and these NGOs, and it got him access, and people then wanted him for access, and it's the quid pro quo that goes along in the cultural sector, which is really interesting because I think most people wouldn't get it. One of the longest running CIA psyops is a periodical called the Paris Review of Books, which is a really highbrow, legitimate publication in its own right. And what they do is, it was set up by the CIA in a non-aligned country, right? France was part of NATO, and then it leaves NATO because de Gaulle's like, fuck you, I'm not going to become an American colony. Eventually, France rejoins NATO. God bless de Gaulle. My only problem with de Gaulle is that he's not English. I want an English de Gaulle. That's what I want. If I was French, de Gaulle would be my hero. De Gaulle is my hero. And I think, to all the Canadians out there, to give a little context to the Quebecois speech, it sucks. The Quebecois, the Pepsis are super annoying, I know. But I'm pretty sure de Gaulle gave the Quebecois speech as payback for a CIA assassination attempt. He was like, because it happens shortly after an assassination attempt by the CIA. They support a French or sort of right-wing, what is it, the Secret Army, the organization, I can't remember what it is, the OAS, another OAS to Organization of American States, who are the Algerian guys, and they really don't want to give up Algeria. They're super committed to keeping Algeria, and de Gaulle is initially very committed to keeping Algeria, and then he sees the writing on the wall, and he's like, well, we're not going to keep Algeria. Sorry, so I'll wheel and deal. I'm a realist. And de Gaulle has presented enough problems to the Americans over other things, and so the Americans do not give a shit about Algeria, I promise you that. The Americans were not at all invested in France keeping Algeria, but they saw a reason. The CIA saw an opportunity to knock off de Gaulle, and they tried to do it, and then de Gaulle was like, "Okay, I'm going to try and make a pig's breakfast of North America for you guys then," which is the context of the Quebecois speech. I have nothing to back that up. This is totally inferences on my part, sort of seeing these webs, trying to connect the dots. I would put some money down on that bet, though, that was the motivation of de Gaulle. I might be getting my dates a little bit mixed up there, though. So, but So that's an interesting. So the Paris Review of Books is a cultural thing set up in the 50s or the 60s as a way of countering Marxist ideas in the intelligentsia. How can we make liberalism? How can we make liberalism appealing to, culture makers? And that's what the Paris Review of Books is. So the culture is that art scene has always been a very important sector for shaping public opinion, but not just that, for them to make connections with one another. So today we're looking at the Korean War. It kind of seesaws back and forth. Eisenhower and his team. In between that and Khrushchev, I forgot to put something in there. The 1956 crisis. There's three big things happen in '56, and I'm going to talk about one of them in depth. The Suez Crisis, and Khrushchev, and the denouncement of Stalin. Stalin dies in '53, and in '56, Khrushchev gives this secret speech to the party Congress, denouncing Stalin, and I'm apologize for my chair. Any questions before I get going? No. Exactly, Renegade. At the bar. Alright. So, I've talked a couple of times now about the inter-service rivalry that happens in the late 40s and early 50s between the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy. And the Air Force holds domination, holds control over this system, largely because they're the only ones able to deliver nuclear weapons to... every time my chair moves now, I feel guilty. They're the only ones that are able to deliver nuclear weapons to Russia, which is a big advantage. But something big happens here. The U.S. Navy develops in this time period that we're looking at. The U.S. Navy develops the USS Nautilus. I can't remember the guy. Is it Rickover? I think Admiral Rickover is the guy's name. He is the father of the nuclear navy, he's called. Is it Rickover? I'm just having a look here. It is Rickover. Admiral Rickover is involved with the development of the USS Nautilus. He's also involved with the nuclear aircraft carriers. But he gets the Nautilus there program going, and now the Navy has a way of delivering nuclear weapons. In that bottom right corner, that's a Polaris missile, which is the first sort of generation of submarine-delivered ICBMs. And what the development of the nuclear submarine allows is for submarines to be undergo extremely long deployments in a way that the previous diesel-electric powered submarines were not able to do. Maybe a diesel-electric could stay underwater for a couple of days. A nuclear-powered submarine can stay underwater pretty much indefinitely, pretty much until the food runs out. They're able to clean the air. They're able to clean the water. So they're really able to go underwater for a very long time, and which means they can go underwater and just disappear. And they have a very low frequency radio communication. They check in with every 12 hours or so. And if they see that Washington has said, nuke them, they then come up and send off the missiles, which thankfully never happened. So there's this rebalancing of military budgets. The Air Force sort of loses some of the primacy that it had. But then something else happens which keeps the Army in the mix, which is, of course, Korea. Now, Korea is really interesting. Oh, I should say about Rickover, interestingly. Rickover is... he becomes the sort of godfather of the American nuclear power. And when 3 Mile Island happens, he's brought in as a sort of authority to vouch for nuclear power. It's quite an interesting story. There's a Netflix miniseries about 3 Mile Island that I think is worth watching. I just thought it was interesting. I just thought I might mention that. There's a whole sort of set of policies that the U.S. Air Force pushes in the lead up to this. They basically, because of their dominance, push for massive retaliation, basically mutually assured destruction. But in the development of these I'm going to hop back again to this. In the development of the weapon systems that the Air Force needs, by the time they become active, they're already obsolete. And you can see this in the B-36, I think it's the B-47, which are the two generation of bombers that sit between the B-29 Superfortress, which dropped the bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and the B-52. The B-52 is in development from 1946. This is still in use today. It's been it doesn't fly till 52, I think, is the test flight. But the B-52 is in development in 1946. So for a lot of you, these airplanes are older than your parents, which is quite a remarkable thing. It's quite an interesting bit of engineering. Interesting to see what might replace the B-52, if anything. I thought I might mention that. So, Korea. Korea is the first... we looked at, the Berlin airlift 2 episodes ago, I think it was, which was sort of Stalin kind of trying to... call the West bluff. The Korean War is the first time that really this status quo of the Cold War gets disrupted in a major way. There is an agreement at the end of the Second World War that Korea will half of Korea will be communist and half of Korea will be liberal. It's one of the reasons why some people make the justification for dropping the bomb on Japan that you could have potentially had North and South Japan, a northern communist Japan and a southern liberal Japan, because Stalin would have. I think it's ridiculous. I don't think Stalin was ever going to launch any sort of intervention on Japan. I don't think he had the capabilities to. But this picture is a rather famous picture of the Marines landing at Incheon. If you didn't know it, you would think that's the Second World War. Korea is often thought of as the Forgotten War. It's sometimes called the Forgotten War. But no one has Korea on their radar in the late 40s. The real concern is that the CCP is going to invade Taiwan, and that Taiwan would fall in 1950.
I'm just wondering, what is the reasoning behind when they do these, they split up these countries, like North and South Vietnam, North and South Korea? East and West Germany?
I think it's a realization of we can't. It's a speed bump. Well, it's better than just surrendering the whole peninsula to the Soviets. And it's also because in a lot of these countries during the Second World War, there's competing factions. And it's one of the ways of going like separating the factions because, there are communists in in Vietnam. There's also Catholics. So we'll talk about this next episode. Do you know the picture of the monk lighting himself on fire from Vietnam? Do you know that? Have you seen that?
Is it a famous picture?
Yeah, it's quite famous.
Okay.
Let me see if I can find it. There's a very famous picture of a monk lighting himself on fire. And a lot of people think that is about the Vietnam War. What Quigley says is that actually no, this monk did not light himself on fire because of the Korean War or because of the Vietnam War. What he's lighting himself on fire for is it's this one, by the way. I've just put it up on screen. What this guy is protesting in this picture, it's an iconic picture. Of course he dies, is the treatment of the Buddhist majority by the South Vietnamese Catholic ruling class. There's a family of Catholics that basically runs South Vietnam in the 50s and 60s, and the Buddhists are very unhappy about this. They're not treated very well by the Catholics, apparently, and that's what this protest is about. So well, how do you keep Catholics and communists apart? How do you prevent a Vietnamese civil war? Well, you give each faction half of the country, right? Or you split the country in half. And similarly, it kind of prevents, the two blocks from really fighting about it, or at least deferring the fight to another day, and not yet risking a war. Have you seen this picture before, Jeff?
Right. Doesn't ring a bell for me.
Really? Okay. Anyway, the thought is that Taiwan's going to fall. China's really interesting because it is Quigley describes China in basically communist China as from when Mao takes over to when Quigley finishes the book. Quigley describes it as a rabid dog which bites every friendly hand. And China, as in some sort of like demonstration of its independence or ability to, or autonomy, will bite down on anyone that tries to help it in this period. They're not able to invade Taiwan. They kind of see the pointlessness of it. There's a few times where they really push the envelope in the late 40s and 50s, but they kind of look around and I think they decide, actually, Korea is a nice domino to focus on. And they support the Chinese and the Russians both support North Korea invading South Korea. Now you can see there on the left, the North Koreans push down. So I should say Korea is quite interesting. It's under Japanese It's part of the Japanese Empire till 1945, and again, it gets its independence, and they separate the country. Right now, the North Korean invasion is initially really, really successful. The South Koreans are not ready for it. And in June of 1950, they attack. And they push the South Korean forces down to that small pocket that's called the Pusan Pocket by September 1950. The Soviets are not expecting U.S. ground forces to intervene. But American divisions there are the Koreans. The North Koreans invaded in June 25th. July 9th, there's American troops. An entire division has been shuffled over from Japan. The Navy and Air Force reposition from being oriented around Taiwan to being oriented around Korea. So actually the Chinese make a massive strategic mistake here. It's thought that they probably could have taken Taiwan. They don't. They pivot to South Korea. But in pivoting to South Korea, they failed to get either. They miss out on South Korea, and they never can take Taiwan because they're I don't know what the idea behind that is, but they decide to back down over Taiwan, and they're still waiting to take Taiwan. Right? We're still hearing about agitation. The North Koreans get wrecked by the UN forces. One of the things that happens is the Soviets, I think, don't yet really understand what the UN is and what the potential of the UN is. You know, we can talk a lot about how ineffectual the UN is. That's largely because of the Security Council, and you have China and Russia on the Security Council, and they're able to block whatever they want to block. The Chinese and Russians are abstain from the Security Council on the day, because out of protest, on the day that there's a vote for whether or not there should be an international intervention in Korea. And so they're able to put together probably the most successful international force that's ever existed. Probably one of the most multinational forces that's ever existed. There's a huge number of countries that participate. And in repayment, the South Koreans will help in Vietnam. And they're known for being the craziest bastards in Vietnam because they hate the communists so much. And the North Vietnamese are like, yeah, just leave the South Koreans alone. There's these sort of pictures and maybe footage of Americans on patrol with South Koreans, and the South Korean APCs are shooting anything that moves because they have a different set of rule of engagement than the Americans, and the Americans are like, yeah, we can't shoot until we're fired upon, and the South Koreans are like, well, we hate communists, blam. So the Soviets miss out an opportunity to forestall this, and basically the UN army invades. They are massive. Obviously the Americans are the biggest contributing force, and they push all the way up to the Yalu River, pretty much. The Chinese see this, and that's from September to November, right? So 2 months. The Americans retake the whole Korean peninsula. The Chinese see this and they go, oh, well, this is an embarrassment. We're going to lose face over this one. And so now we go over into the right-hand map, which is the Chinese invasion. And you can listen to these guys talk about these American GIs talk about what it was like, and some of them are like, it was the most amazing sight I've ever seen. Tens of thousands of Chinese running over down a mountain and up the other side, and the noise they made. And we fired until we ran out of bullets, and we threw cans of beans at them. And a huge mass of Chinese men just sweep south, and you can see that in the fact that once again the Allies get pushed very, very far south. They then sort of push back, excuse me, and establish that boundary by July 1953. But a huge amount of the fighting is done over 6 months. They've gone up and down the Korean Peninsula, 2 or 3 times. Now, what happens is MacArthur comes along. That's MacArthur on the right. He's sort of the American viceroy, basically, of Japan. And Truman sends him over. MacArthur thinks that war with the Soviets is inevitable. And at one point in, I think it's before the Chinese get involved, or maybe after the Chinese get involved, MacArthur really makes peace impossible. An earlier peace impossible. And MacArthur is talking about nuking Beijing and Moscow over Korea. Truman can't have this. Pulls him out. MacArthur, I think, if you'd spoken to an American in 1941, December 6, 1941, right, the day before Pearl Harbor, and you'd ask them about who their favorite general was, like a guy, just an army guy, they probably would have said MacArthur. No one would have really known who Eisenhower was. No one would have known who Bradley was. They might have known who Marshall was. Everybody knew who MacArthur was. MacArthur was the celebrity of the army. And I suspect MacArthur was planning on running for president before the thought ever entered Eisenhower's head. But this debacle over Korea really ends him, and he kind of leaves. And there's this famous speech he gives at his retirement. He has a ticker tape parade when he gets back to New York. People on the right really liked him and what he was trying to do. He gives a speech. Old soldiers never die; they just fade away. And that's sort of an interesting idea. An interesting idea of the way he viewed himself. It would have been interesting. I can only speculate what a MacArthur presidency would have looked like. And I think what MacArthur represents, though, is a turn from isolationism on the right to interventionism, and MacArthur's willingness to consider escalating the Korean War. But I think what the problem is that the Americans think that through enough effort they can return to sort of the world as it was in the 1880s. This is sort of what Quigley says. But and that with enough effort and force they can kind of return to that. They don't really understand the new role that they've made for themselves in some ways. They're basically expecting the Pax Britannia to come back. They don't really realize that they're the ones that will have to pay for it. And MacArthur realizes, I think, what this Pax Americana is going to involve. The sort of proactiveness that will be necessary. Now, of course, involved in all of this, involved in these conversations, incidentally, the Korean War ends in 1953, and there's the armistice, which is still going. I think they're still technically at war. Anyway, the American establishment is very involved in this, right? That on the left, that's John Foster Dulles, and on the right is his brother Allen Dulles. John Foster Dulles is brought into the State Department. He's involved with a lot of this stuff. He's part of the sort of J.P. Morgan sphere. And sorry for my chair. He advocates a policy of boldness, a really robust, offensive MacArthur sort of doctrine. He formally ends the war with Japan. The war with Japan has been going for 5 or 6 years now, technically. But there's lengthy peace negotiations that happen. Formally, peace treaty signed September 8th, 1951. That's considered a bit of a coup for John Foster Dulles. But what I really care about is that he signs the ANZUS Treaty, Australia, New Zealand, U.S. Treaty, which is a Pacific-oriented treaty. But what I see in that is the undermining of British links with Australia and New Zealand, the destruction of Britain as the center of gravity for those countries, and America pulling in Australia and New Zealand into its sphere, into its orbit, which I think was always the plan. That's a good point. If there are any questions, if there's any, let's have a look here.
Well, is the character of Popeye the Sailor Man based on General MacArthur?
No, I don't think so. I think Popeye is older than Popeye is from pre-war. I'm pretty sure. I'm not too familiar with Chinese history, Dark of the Dark, but yeah, I think you're right. Same's true with India. Indians are not great with alliances. Someone says something quite interesting, and I can't remember who says it. I can't remember where I got this, but someone says the difference between it might be Quigley. And someone says the difference between Europe and Asia. One of the big differences in international policy. This might be Mearsheimer. I'm not sure. I don't think it is Mearsheimer. Actually, is that the smallest European nation could not really be conquered for a long time in Europe. Could not be conquered and just absorbed totally. And if someone did just declare war arbitrarily in Europe, it was really, really looked down upon. There would have been a lot of, if you played EU4, there would have been a lot of aggressive expansion, right? From taking territory in a war that was more than thought fair. I really wish I could remember where I got this from. But that in India, they were comparing it to India, that in India, it was just a free-for-all, and no one gave a shit. And you could just grab whatever you wanted, and it was just survival of the strongest. Whereas in Europe, from 1200 to Napoleon, there really was a sort of informal international order that governed Europe in a lot of ways that we don't really respect. So the alliances in Asia are a lot more tenuous. I think you're right about that. Edward Yanes. I'm mostly
Did it also
surprised.
have to do with religion, though?
Possibly. I certainly think that there's something to that. The problem with the India is different. India is, I don't know how to account for India in this way, but I think the problem the Chinese would have with an alliance is seeing someone as an equal when they have this ancient conception of themselves as the Middle Kingdom and the font of civilization for humans. That like the virtue of the heavenly court passes through the emperor and the court in the imperial court, and sort of radiates outwards, and that everybody else is a barbarian. That isn't Chinese is a barbarian. So of course, you can't really betray a barbarian. If you break a treaty with a barbarian, there is no one to hold you to account conceptually. There's no authority, because you are the font of that authority on Earth.
I can tell you also, as someone who's grown up in the face culture, that Chinese people are very easily offended, and it's like every little slight is seen as unforgivable. So it doesn't matter if we've signed a contract, you slighted me by insulting my sister's looks or something, and then it's over. Alliance is off.
Yeah, that's interesting. The first thing that reminds me of is dwarves from Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, from Lord of the Rings and Warhammer. The Warhammer dwarves are particularly offended, and they'll fight wars over minor offensives. I like what Glock says. I'm mostly surprised how much admiration I've gained for the South Koreans since this video started. They're crazy. I just wish they'd start having babies. Even Dark of the Dark says, even today I've heard some Chinese people say Americans are children with only 400 years of history. This is true. I think Jeff and I have talked about this a lot. When I look at the real potential, the real bright spot China has had with interacting with other countries, I think, and this is a little bit perverse, but I think it is the British, and I think the British and Chinese have produced quite a bright spot in syncretic sort of combinations, and I say it's perverse given the Opium Wars and that sort of thing. I'm not going to commit an anachronism of talking about the Opium Wars as if they were happening today.
But even outside of Hong Kong, Singapore is another example.
Right, and Malaysia. The Chinese. There are Chinese in the West Indies. There are Chinese in South Africa and East Africa. I think that and there was quite a bit of pragmatism from a chancellor of the Exchequer a couple of chancellors ago, George Osborne. He was very pro engaging with China, and at one point it looked like Britain would be the one major Western economy that was prepared to do business with China pragmatically, which I was all for in terms of circumventing America, which I'm very pro. But Dark of the Dark's right. Americans are retards. They have no concept of history. They have no concept of where they come from. They have no concept of the English roots that they occupy. I often say if the one event Americans should learn about that's not part of American history, if they had to learn about a single event, it would be the English Civil War. And Americans can't tell you anything about the English Civil War, but so much of what happens in the American Revolution is in reference to the English Civil War. Yeah, I could go on.
Are you teasing next season when we're going to cover the Royalist Revolution?
No, I have had this thought for quite a long time, independent of the Royalist Revolution. But if you're interested in that, do join us for book club. We're reading the Royalist Revolution. It's an interesting book about how the American founding fathers actually advocated ideas that were on the Royalist side of the English Civil War. And they were trying to make a case that actually Parliament was the problem, not the king. And it's only after 1776 that they fully decide to cut with King George III. But they don't give up the Royalist aspects. And a lot of the Royalist aspects of their cause come to get embodied in the office of the president. That's the theory of the book. If you're interested in that, do read about it. Do read the book and join us. And I don't know what chapters we're covering this week.
Chapter 3, I think.
So John Dulles is Secretary of State. Allen Dulles becomes director of the CIA. Kennedy gets rid of him a couple of years from now. And he may or may not have been involved with Kennedy's assassination. Or maybe you disagree. Maybe you think Kennedy's head just did that. But anyway, the Korean War comes, sort of peters out, and then in... Let's check. Actually, I didn't write this down. President Eisenhower comes in. 53. So just as he's there when the armistice gets signed, and we now have Truman leaves. I'm sure he breathed a sigh of relief leaving. I don't know why, but I have no reason to think this, but I think Truman genuinely saw his presence as some sort of necessary thing, and that I don't think he really enjoyed being president. So I've got John Foster Dulles up there on the right. On the left is a guy named Sherman Adams, who is, I think, a descendant of John Adams. I've not been able to find any information about that. I'm not sure if he is an Adams or not, in the sense of like that family. And of course you got Eisenhower, and a lot of people will forget this, but Nixon was Eisenhower's vice president. Quigley is not super pro Eisenhower. I think he's not mean about Eisenhower, but he just sort of says Eisenhower shouldn't really have been president. The Republican model of presidents up to this period is a bit more based around the cabinet. The Democrats operating up till this period operate a very strong executive presidency, which really, I think that model is based upon FDR just saying like things have to get done. The members of the cabinet in Eisenhower's team have a lot of say and a lot of ability to act. Eisenhower is mild and unobjectionable and really doesn't want to rock the boat too much. He kind of falls into the presidency. He's the great hero of the Second World War. He doesn't disgrace himself like MacArthur does. There's a strange event which happens in 1948 where somebody says something like the board, I can't remember who it is. It's Anglo-American Establishment Person A writing to Anglo-American Establishment Person B, and they sort of say something like, "We need a new president of Columbia University in New York City, right? Probably one of the most left-wing universities in America. We need a new president of the university. Who should we get?" And someone writes, and this person B writes back, "You need Eisenhower." They didn't mean Dwight Eisenhower. They meant his cousin, who was an academic, I think, at Cornell. However, person A doesn't click onto that, and then he thinks that the person B has recommended them Dwight Eisenhower. So Dwight Eisenhower finds himself president of Columbia for 2 years. Sort of a bit puzzling, and I'm sure you must have just sort of, oh, well, okay, fine, I'll be president of Columbia. And then off of that sort of momentum, that serves as a nice bridge from him leaving the army to running for president. He's really kind of just a hero, and people like him, and I think he represents the sort of America that they want, sort of done with the fighting, steady, not left wing, no more, not communist, not anything too right wing. But he has Nixon, and Quigley, even in '66, Quigley's not a fan of Nixon, which doesn't surprise me. He says Nixon's vicious, and engages in sort of counter subversions. He's scheming. Dulles leads the international side of the Eisenhower team's policies. Sherman Adams, the guy on the left, leads domestic things. He has to resign, I think, in '57 because he accepts a fur coat and a rug from someone who's under investigation by the FCC for financial misconduct, and so he has to. Apparently, Nixon has to go in and fire him. Dulles kind of Dulles and the neo-isolationists. I mean, so I said earlier, like, Dulles is a bit more like aggressive, but it's sort of the neo-isolationists have a new kind of take on how to do things. They're not totally isolationist, but they're not. But the idea is like to get themselves sort of inward looking. They sort of start to undo the Truman Doctrine, which is the idea that we'll support people who are trying to engage in self-determination. Dulles doesn't. Where Dulles becomes a neo-isolationist, though, is Dulles does not want to engage in grand alliances. He doesn't want to the UN. He doesn't really want to look to something like NATO. What Dulles wants is a system of direct alliances in which the U.S. is allied directly to another country that it's responsible for. He doesn't want this open-ended, ambiguous relationship with free peoples. And he wants there to be a two-power system. He wants to push countries into either being Soviet aligned or American aligned, because that'll be easier to deal with. This is stupid. It alienates the non-aligned movement, countries like India. And a little country called Egypt. Now, I might rant here for a little bit. I know that's rare for me to do. And before I do rant, I might just look at the chat. Is there anything to say here? Nathan took us to the gold standard, so I agree with Quigley for once. Yeah. Yeah, when we do it, it's planning. When they do it, it's slimy scheming. Yeah, okay. So, if you want to know, there's a few moments in the Anglo-American relationship that I really don't like. I don't like Wilson coming over to Europe, being naive and dealing with Europe and forcing republics on the world, and the naivety of it. I don't like FDR doing the same sort of naive interactions with Stalin. I don't like Bretton Woods, which I'm going to do an episode on, where the Americans force out, basically put an end to the empire economically, and everything that happens then over the next 10, 20 years of the empire falling apart is basically because of Bretton Woods Agreement. I don't like the Americans invading Grenada without consulting Margaret Thatcher. There's an interesting phone recording of Reagan talking to Thatcher, and he calls her Maggie. I'm sorry, if I was there, I'd throw a hat into the room before I came in. And Thatcher is sort of quite stern with him, but no, there's no need for that. But Reagan knows that he should have basically just given a heads up to the British, because Grenada is part of the British Commonwealth. I don't like how when Argentina invades the Falklands, the Americans don't really support the British. I don't like all of those things. But when I think about the thing I don't like the most, it's the Suez Crisis. Because the Suez Crisis, I think, demonstrates more than any other event that the Americans do not value the British. The Americans do not appreciate the British. The Americans only want and expect the British to support them whenever it's in the America's interest. Basically, America operates a dual country system in which two countries are at the core operating for America's interest, which are Britain and America. However, this system does not ever advocate for Britain's interest. Oh, another event I don't really like. I don't like Clinton coming over and forcing the British to destroy British sovereignty over Northern Ireland. But Suez shows that the Americans simply do not give a shit about Britain. And the sooner Britain wakes up to this, the sooner Britain cuts off all cooperative ties with America, the better, as far as I'm concerned. If I was in charge of this country, I would be looking toward a very strong relationship with Kanzuk and France. That's the way I would operate. 3 things happened in 1956. Okay, I got them on this slide. You have, in the left, the Hungarian uprising. In the bottom right, the Tibetan uprising. China's gone into Tibet, and the Tibetans have have an uprising in 56, and the Suez crisis in 56. I'm going to come back to that. Basically, what happens is Eisenhower looks at the world and he goes, I care about making some point over Hungary. And what he does is he simply ignores Tibet because he doesn't. There's a little sort of political calculations, and the amount of political capital he can use. He simply ignores Tibet. He focuses on Hungary. And he does something quite shitty in that he votes, for the only time, he votes against Britain in the Security Council. Now, what has happened in Suez in 56? Well, that guy on the left, who, I don't like to say this sort of stuff, but with him, it's true. I hope he's burning in hell. Gamal Abdel Nasser, is president of Egypt, and he seizes the Suez Canal in a story that we're going to see over and over and over again for the next couple of decades after this. He goes, this is Egypt's, and the French and the British scratch their heads and go, well, that's funny because we built it. We put all the money into it. This is not yours. And they make they go to the Israelis and they make an agreement and they go, well, look, here's what we'll do. You guys start a war with Egypt. And then French and British peacekeepers will intervene conveniently along the corridor of the Suez Canal and keep you two apart. This goes off, but it leaks that this was the plan. And all the shitty, anti-colonial liberals in Britain and France get their knickers in a twist. The Americans, I'm sure the Americans were quite happy to see Nasser have the canal. They didn't want to push Nasser into the hands of Khrushchev. And, I mean, they did it. They should have known that's what was going to happen anyway. In the picture up at the top, those are British paratroopers. The picture on the bottom, I'm quite sure that is an Egyptian M4 Sherman. The Egyptians have been given. It might be Israeli. It might be Israeli now that I think about it. I'm pretty sure it's not British or French. But yeah, so a lot of pressure is put on the British and the French, and they withdraw, and they basically throw away the Suez Canal to the Egyptians, which is, I think, a terrible mistake, and I hate Eisenhower for it. But anyway, any questions on Suez? And so we move into Khrushchev and Stalin here. Now, Khrushchev comes to power in the 50s. I can't remember exactly the time period that it happens. There's a sort of the Politburo rules for a while. Stalin dies. Jeff, are you still there, by the way? I haven't heard you for a while.
Yep, I'm still here.
Oh, you sound...
I'm just lying down.
Yeah, okay. All right. We don't have much more. This is a slightly shorter one than I usually do. So Khrushchev comes to power over the course of a year, 2 years, 3 years, from March. Stalin dies 5th of March, 1953. and Khrushchev comes to power, which is a good thing for the Russians. I actually think it's a bad thing for the West that Stalin dies. I think Stalin was very much not interested in significantly agitating the West, but Khrushchev was a bit more prepared to push the envelope. But things got a lot better in Russia for the average Russian. The USSR, two things to say. It did not want to fight the U.S., and it was it underwent a bit of a power struggle. I think it's Malenkov and Khrushchev are the two big powers trying to get into position. Excuse me. Stalin. Okay, yeah, and the good thing for Russians is that Stalin dies, Quigley says, at the beginning of what was going to become the Third Great Purge, and so Russia avoids a purge. So I'm not, however, going to do a lot on this for one significant reason. This is only, for Quigley, about 10 years in the rearview mirror. And the amount of information that comes out is very small. And Quigley is trying to read tea leaves and try and figure out what actually is going on behind in Russia in the 50s. It's a lot of guessing. There is, however, something that's quite interesting about which is that Khrushchev, outwardly at least, when he beats Malenkov, and he begins to liberalize, and he puts out this thing called the Belgrade Declaration. Stalin hates Tito, who's the leader of Yugoslavia. When Khrushchev comes in, there's a bit of a rapprochement with Tito, and they Stalin advocates something called communism in one country, or socialism in one country, which is that you don't need to have a worldwide revolution yet. You can focus those energies in Russia, and you can, but it's quite authoritarian. It's very, this is where we get this idea of Stalinism. Khrushchev, in the Belgrade Declaration, talks about there are many different roads to socialism. We don't need to have a single process that everybody goes through. He really pushes for better relationships with the satellite states, but he's still prepared to intervene in Hungary. Now, what's interesting, though, is at the same time that Hungary's happening, a very similar thing happens in Poland, but Khrushchev backs down. So I can't really account for that, other than perhaps Hungary is on the border with Austria, and thereby is a bit closer to the West in some ways than Poland is. So Hungary necessitates a much more harsher intervention. Anyway, the Warsaw Pact forms in 1955, and that sort of comes together. But what the really interesting thing, and despite all these other things, there's a thawing of relationships with the West, particularly led by the British. The British are much more realistic about relationships with the USSR. So Anthony Eden leads this effort, and Dulles is very reluctant. Now, what is interesting is in 1956, Khrushchev gives this speech. It's called it's called The Secret Speech by some. But there's another name for it. The actual name for it is On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences. And sorry, I apologize for my chair. And he denounces Stalin, and he says that Stalin was bloodthirsty and repressive, and that this was all bad for socialism. Now, what's really interesting about that is that this speech is apparently what leads to Khrushchev and Mao going their own ways, because Mao sees Khrushchev as a revisionist and not properly socialist, and so what happens is Mao goes off on his own way and will not long after Quigley writes this. Let's have a look here. Nixon goes over to Beijing in 1972. And the Americans are over the moon about this because what they're able to do is draw the Chinese out of the Soviet system. And they're able to start opening up China to America, making things in China, and to undercut the Russians. The Russians now have an exposed southern flank. There's a few little border conflicts that happen between the Russians and the Chinese. It's not a happy relationship. I think if you're looking at the world today in 2024 and you look at the last 2 years, I think the way you should look at Ukraine from a Chinese perspective is this is great because the Americans are throwing away, the West is throwing away billions of dollars. The Russians are bleeding themselves dry. We're propping up Putin, and we're not going to have to fight a war with Russia because they're going to be so indebted to us at the end of this process that we will have inverted the situation from 60, 70 years ago. I don't know this. I don't know this to be the case. Jeff, I don't know if you know this, but I assume that the century of humiliation probably cuts both ways, not just anti-West, but probably anti-Russian as well. And there's probably a view amongst the Chinese that we can get our own back at the Russians too. And if I was the Japanese, I would think, well, how are they going to come for us?
It's certainly something that we don't hear about a lot in general.
Yeah.
Most of the ire of the Chinese is directed at the West rather than anything to do with Russia.
Yeah. So, it's interesting to say, though, Quigley doesn't just... He blames Stalin. But he also blames the Soviet system. He sort of says this is sort of inevitable, the craziness of this, given the way this power structure has been constructed. The three conflicts that I talk about in 56, around 1950, both recognize that they're not strong enough to force neutrals which in an early episode we talk about them, the buffer fringe, and that's one of the ways you can think about them. That they're not powerful enough to force neutrals into their own blocks. And so rather what begins to happen is a policy not of getting allies, but denying allies to the other bloc. So just making sure India is a really good example. Making sure India doesn't go communist. And the communists likewise, just making sure India doesn't become super pro-West. If you read Operation Gladio, you'll see in there similar idea with Italy. The view of the Allies, the view of sort of those NATO countries is that, at least in Europe, Italy's the test, because Italy has quite a lot of support of communists, and if the Russians are going to make a move, they're going to make a move in Italy. So just sort of hold the line. Don't hold on to your gains and just deny the other side their effort to try and take other people. There's one little quote here I want to read. This was on the one hand, the buffer fringe. This was a double one. The acceptance of neutralism and this is on neutrality and the buffer fringe, and the sort of trying to herd them. On the one hand, it meant that superpowers' attitude towards the buffer fringe shifted from a basically offensive one to a basically defensive one. Shifted from an effort to get them to join one's own side to an effort to keep them from joining the opponent's side. This is a significant bit. And at the same time, it marked the first beginnings of true wisdom and true hope, tragedy and hope, true hope for the world's future, in the recognition that there are more than two alternative fashions for organizing a functioning economic, social, and political system. In the long run, this recognition will be a victory for the West. For the West has always, in its real nature, recognized that reality is diverse and is pluralist, while it has always been the Russian way to insist that reality is dualistic, with each extreme necessarily monistic and uniform. The acceptance of diversity and of pluralism by the inevitable failure of both capitalism and communism in the buffer fringe has forced the West to accept and apply its own, often unrecognized traditions. That's a very important passage. There's a few things coming together there. One are very early episodes on Russia, the buffer fringe, and the West. The other is this tragedy of the age of conflict, right? This is tragedy and hope, to say it again, for those of you who haven't heard this before. What I haven't heard anyone say, what I think the value of this the Iron Age Archive analysis of tragedy and hope is, we've specifically framed it in Quigley's other work, The Evolution of Civilizations. I haven't heard anyone else frame it in reference to the evolution of civilizations. And what tragedy and hope is an analysis of the third stage of conflict. There's 7 stages of civilization. There's mixture, gestation, expansion, conflict, the universal empire, decay, and collapse. And the West is unique. It's one of the unique. Each civilization has a unique feature, and the Western civilization's unique feature is its ability to short-circuit the system and go back and repeat ages of expansion. And what we're in is the third age of conflict. We've had an age of expansion, age of conflict, age of expansion, age of conflict, age of expansion, and we're in the third age of conflict when Quigley's writing this book. And Quigley's hope is that what we'll be able to do is have a fourth age of expansion. And we can achieve a fourth age of expansion here if we realize that there is not a single pathway, that there's a plurality of approaches to achieving expansion, but situated within that, you can see what we would say is quite a dangerous approach, because the obvious answer to how you achieve a fourth age of expansion, how you become pluralist, is to become managerial. Now, there's an interesting thing that this is my thoughts in real time. I didn't think about this in prepping for this, but I'm kind of going to leave this as an open question for you guys to think about. I'm going to think about this. Jeff, I'm sure will think about this. Is managerialism realism? I've advocated a very strong line in favor of a pre-World War I British global system because it was realist. I'm pretty damning where me and Quigley agree the British system was great. Where Quigley and I differ is he says the British imperial system moving the global system of empires moving to the global system of ideological blocks. Quigley's like, well, this is fine as long as we have America advocating for the West in this ideological bloc. But it seems like there's a conflict there, because he also advocates for managerialism, and I don't know how managerialism is actually effective if it's not realist about the world. But that's also a weird thought that I've never thought about before, which is how realist is managerialism. I hope that makes sense.
There is one kind of conflict that I see between the two, which is that managerialism becomes increasingly technical, and it becomes increasingly by the book. Whereas realism, there is an element of the personal.
That's a good point.
Means that sometimes you have to make a personal decision.
You start to become too committed to the algorithm rather than the problem the algorithm was developed to fix. And yeah, that's a really good point. That's it. That's where we're gonna leave it for today. If there are any questions, Jeff, you've been quiet. We know why. You've been lying down, recovering. Sorry, Dark, for the chair squeaking. I don't know what to do about it. I don't have another chair at the moment. Renegade, having a plurality of ways to short circuit back to expansion only holds true if you can maintain the plurality, keeping them at a stalemate, isn't it? The other gets stamped out. Quigley says that I don't think. I'm trying to think about the question. I don't think Quigley would see a conflict there. What Quigley talks about in the evolution of civilizations in the ages of expansion is that in different areas of the culture, whether it be militarily or science or religion or something else, in one of those areas, the civilization figures out a way to save up a surplus and put it towards productive usage elsewhere. And I think Quigley would say, actually, the West realizing plurality is very conducive for the accumulation of the surplus and its uses in productive ways. And instead of sticking to an ideological commitment to one thing or the other, we can make progress. My objection, not my objection, but my immediate thought in response to that is, what it assumes is that you can continually be developing a productive increase, and I'm not sure you can. I think it's one of those things where people complain about the West not growing as fast as a random third world country, right? If you are Niger and you get your act together, it's really easy to add 10% economic growth a year, right? France trying to add 10% economic growth a year is not going to happen because it's peaking in terms of what the technological capacity currently is. Whether or not you can indefinitely have technological advancement at a steady rate, I don't know if you can. I'm not saying no, but I'm a little bit skeptical. And we're certainly not committed to research in the way that we used to be. And that's what we need a surplus for. If you look at countries, the investment of GDP to research, we could be doing a lot better. We could be doing a lot better than we are. I think Japan and South Korea do quite well in those investments. I'll have to look at the numbers. We could do a lot better. We could do a lot better. But we've made this inward turn. We have made this inward turn where we're wringing our hands about welfare queens, and we're debating about wearing masks for boomers and that sort of thing in a way that we need. Our civilization needs to be destabilized.
There's also the Henry Kissinger perspective, which is that Henry Kissinger always talks about the balance of global power, where in his mind, anytime a nation gets too far ahead of the other nations, it's bad for the world. So Henry Kissinger is always trying to play this game where, if USA gets too advanced and too self-reliant, that's bad for the rest of the world, that's bad for global trade. So now we got to boost the economy in China. And try to always create this balance between East and West.
I don't know how inevitable I think that is, or how able the rest of the world is to come along and create a counterbalance. I'll have to think about that. My hope, if I were thinking about quickly, how would I want to kickstart a fourth age of expansion? I had a few ideas. One was, maybe we can do something with space. Maybe it's something with information technology. But actually, I know what I think it is now. And I think it's climate change. And I said something to Jeff. I mentioned an idea very briefly for an episode that I want to do in the future. But I've been reading a number of things, and this is coming from a number of directions. I'm reading a bit more sort of anthropology stuff at the moment. And there's a recurring theme, which is that climate change pushes history. And climate change creates this... I heard that, yeah. What happens is organisms settle down into a stable network. And you need networks to get destabilized in order for something to change. And it looks like climate is one of the prime, if not the single biggest destabilizer that exists for organisms. And I have actually become optimistic about climate change. I think it's a good thing because it presents a challenge to us to respond to and to develop a new set of productive capacities to deal with. Now that might sound dangerously managerial or technocratic, but I'm thinking if we're going to use Jeff's distinction between the realism and managerialism, I'm more realist about it. I don't. Heidegger presents to us this sort of three ways to confront these problems, to confront the problem of technology. You can become a Luddite and turn your back on it, but the progress will continue to happen. You can embrace it and you can get absorbed into it and become inflamed by it, or you can live with it in a way that it does not control you. And I think that's the angle that we need to take, and the angle that I'm sort of thinking about along those lines.
People are, the modern mindset is uncomfortable with that answer because it's like, but I want the system, I want the algorithm, right? Tell me the systematic way to fix things.
Which is, it's
rather than,
yeah, but the idea, this is a very Latour idea, like the sort of Latour says like, we live in this artificial division of the world between nature and society. Nature and society have always lived together. They've always acted on one another. One does not create the other. They both create each other. They both push each other. And if you treat one as being sort of apart from the other, you're going to have problems. And the idea that I just want the algorithm is, I think, a very bad idea, thinking about Latour. Renegade, we don't know what actually happened with the volcanic ash, but here's something really weird. I'm going to give you a really weird thing, right? It's actually really good to live by volcanoes, because volcanic ash is great for soil. Soil around volcanoes is incredibly fertile and is very nutrient dense, which is why people live so close to them in lots of parts of the world. It's thought that they probably had something to do with human evolution, part of that climatic push, and that we probably evolved close. But we don't know we don't really know what happened, what impact the volcano had on the climate. I mean, for whether it created the little ice age or not, or whether, it's very difficult to say. But yeah, another way, a climatic event in a way that pushes history that might be good. It's a little bit different, is the Black Death. The Black Death really shakes things up because the labor market in Europe gets a lot more powerful. I think it's the early 1300s the Black Death hits, and basically a generation later you have the Renaissance, because labor is much more valuable because there's a third less of it, and land is a lot less valuable because you don't need to grow as much food now. You only need to grow 2/3 the food you did before. And it pushes a lot of resources into the hands of the middle class, and creates a middle class that is able to develop learn how to read, gets interested in ideas. So, I mean, in that sense, the Black Death is an environmental event that sort of pushes history. If there's no questions on your end, Jeff. Next episode, I'm conceptually chapter. Occasionally, Quigley does this, right, where there's some things that are better in other chapters. I kind of don't know why he puts them in. I'm going to include some bits about Asia that are at the back of chapter 18. We're going to and then so we're going to do the last bit of chapter 18, chapter 19, and that'll be the nuclear stalemate, which I know seems like we've done 3 or 4 episodes on the nuclear stuff. It's in this chapter too, and it's a little bit repetitive. I have not dealt with the stuff in this chapter. A lot of the stuff you've heard over the past few episodes have included that. Again, it's just like race for the bomb and who got to what bomb first, and it's just not as relevant or interesting, I think, to do it again. I think we dealt with it, and I haven't gone through chapter 19 yet. But if there's more of that in there, if there's anything redundant in there, I'm not gonna put it in. But I think the bit in there is about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I think is interesting and worth talking about. But Asia and Latin America, and really the beginning of the end of colonialism, particularly French and British colonialism, although the Portuguese are in there as well. And I don't think there's any other empires that exist in that period. And we're nearly done. I think there's only 2 episodes left. There might be 3, and there's going to be maybe a China episode, but I'm not sure. But yeah, we're nearly done. We're nearly there. And I hope you guys have been enjoying it. So, anything else? Book club. Book club, if you're interested. The Royalist Revolution. If you think anything's working or not working, let me know. I'm interested to make this the best stream I can. And if you have any ideas for episodes, any interesting things, let us know.
Also, I think we're planning on streaming regularly on Fridays.
Right.
Set time.
Yeah, which is, I don't know if you're planning on being there for that, Jeff. The idea is that I will go whether Jeff's here or not. And that's going to be off-cuts. And when it's not off-cuts, it'll be things that I've just sort of been working on. Yeah. I'm trying to think of the right analogy. This is the main feature, and Friday nights are for the diehards, the hardcore. I don't know if that's the right way to put it. But if you like tragedy, these episodes, you should like what I do on Fridays. Cool. Anything on your end, Jeff?
No, just keep your eye out for a Friday show, and see you guys when we see you guys.
Friday's going to be a little bit of Bronze and Iron Age, and then dealing with the Mesopotamian civilization. Going to be a quick overview of the 7 stages of the Mesopotamian civilization over like 5,000 or 6,000 years. So we're going to go fast through that. So yeah, cool. And it'd be worth watching if you're not interested in Mesopotamia, because it will give you a better idea of how Quigley's model works. Yeah. Cool. All right. See you guys hopefully on Friday. And yeah, don't forget to like, comment, or subscribe. All right.